So I'm going to stop the share just temporarily, but I do want to give you just a minute to take a look at some of the terms and ideas that folks are thinking about, remembering that the Slido app basically allows things to get a little bit larger if or more bold if those are phrases or words that were used more than once. So it looks like a question about empathy with boundaries, a sense of calm and misunderstanding, and creating safe spaces, or as we say through the PSU system from the LGBTQIA Center, safer places, right? So what does it mean to understand that not all places feel safe to all folks? Take a second to introduce myself and our guest today. So my name is Bonnie Waslek, and I'm the Director of Inclusive Excellence, and I'm also an Associate Professor of Education here at Penn State Abington. And in my capacity of the Director of Inclusive Excellence, I created this panel today as in response to faculty who had expressed concern about how to implement different tools in their classrooms that foreground questions of care and some responsibility in these really troubled times. This being one of them, but also understanding that global crises can hit different folks for different reasons, whether it is war or a catastrophic event due to weather, climate change. So there are lots of things that can happen that can impact not just our students, but our faculty and staff and guests as they come onto our campus as well. And so the purpose of this session is to think very broadly about these understandings and to ask ourselves how we might be better facilitators in the classroom and in other places on our campus as far as the climate is concerned. So I'm going to start with some very quick introductions. Pull them up. And I'm going to start with Carla Chamberlain, who will be our first presenter today. And I'll introduce all three and then let them go ahead and start with their presentations. Then we're going to have a little bit of open Q&A time, a discussion within the panel, and then some time for participants to engage as well and think not just with the panel, but with each other as professionals across the PSU system. So Dr. Chamberlain, her teaching and research focuses on intercultural communication and second language learning and teaching in new media environments. She's interested in how personal and group identities are created through language and media, and how mediated identities interact with attitudes toward language, policy, and intercultural education. Her current research agenda examines discourses of mass media as they portray second language learners and bilingualism in the United States. Dr. Hughes presents her work at international conferences and is a member of the Teachers of English of Speakers of Other Languages, TESOL, the International Association of Intercultural Education, and the International Society for Language Studies, and the American Association for Applied Linguistics, and the National Association for Media Literacy Education. She serves on the editorial board of Journal of Intercultural Education. Her program, Teachers as Intercultural Learners, is offered through Penn State Abington's Office of Continuing Education. We also have with us today Kevin Sieber, who is our head librarian at Penn State Abington since March of 2023. So pretty new, but incredibly impactful in his time here. He previously worked at the University of Colorado, Denver, serving as the Education and Outreach Services Department Head for ARIA Library from 2018 to 2023, as well as being ARIA's first teaching and learning librarian from 2015 to 2018. Before, he was the librarian instruction coordinator for Colorado State University Pueblo from 2011 to 2015, and the library operations supervisor at Florida State University's Strasser Library from 2006 to 2011. And then finally, we have Pierce Salguero, who is a professor of Asian history and health humanities, and the program chair for multidisciplinary studies, health humanities, and the ombudsperson here on Penn State Abington's campus. He describes himself as a transdisciplinary scholar of health humanities who is fascinated by the historical and contemporary intersections between Buddhism, medicine, and cross-cultural exchange. He has a PhD in the history of medicine from Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, teaches history, medicine, and religion at Penn State Abington College, and will be thinking with us today specifically about trauma-informed pedagogy. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Dr. Chamberlain as our first presenter today.
Okay, thank you, Bonnie. I started thinking when you posted that slide out by teaching or think about in times of teaching in times of trauma and crisis. And for me, that is intercultural education. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I mean by intercultural education and intercultural communication, and then talk more specifically about some things that we can think about for our teaching practice. So first of all, I want to define what I mean by intercultural, and I'll say what I don't mean by it. Intercultural communication or competency is not a checklist of behaviors, that we just tick off in a worksheet after a workshop or measure on a scale. It's not the comparison of culture A to culture B. That's cross-cultural studies, and that can be problematic because it usually conceptualizes culture and identity in very monolithic ways. Intercultural communication, on the other hand, is this continually negotiated process among individuals, groups, small groups, large groups, and it is a multimodal and an embodied process. It's also, we think about it as being very situated in social, cultural, historical context, and it's centered on issues of power and status. So that's a difference between this cross-cultural approach and an intercultural approach. So intercultural education is really built on the idea that identity is intersectional, that culture is fluid. It's really a moving thing, constantly evolving. Some people have even written about culture as saying we should think of it as a verb, not a noun. And definitely intercultural interactions are embedded in many different social practices. So we have to look at everything as it's contextualized. And the organization that I've been involved in the most over the past couple of decades is the International Association for Intercultural Education. And this really grew out of a need to reject fixed conceptualizations of cultures and also non-critical perspectives of culture, mostly influenced by Western perspectives where we were trying to measure different aspects or behaviors, or also just looking through a lens of something like as simple as individualism, collectivism, without realizing that that was a Western ideology in itself. So from the beginning, this organization, I'll just call it IAIE, they're about responding to trauma and crises. They really began after World War II in Europe, when schools were dealing with immigration, culturally and linguistically diverse populations of students that nobody was quite sure how to deal with yet. So that's where it began. And since then, unfortunately, times of trauma and crisis have continued around the world. And the organization decided, 25, 30 years ago that they could not be European centered, that they had to be more international. So I stepped in slightly after that. So today we focus on effects of polarization around the world, populations who are vulnerable to crimes against humanity, social injustices, and we focus on education and wellness for refugees, asylum seekers, migrants, displaced persons, and we're involved in all kinds of educational initiatives, including peace education and creating spaces for really healthy conflict and productive dialogue. And this often happens in classrooms. So we deal a lot with teachers. A few weeks ago, I was at one of our conferences. We typically co-sponsor conferences with other organizations around the world. So we've had conferences in Israel and South Korea, and we're planning, new ones all over the world. We haven't had any in the US yet, actually. But this latest conference was in Sarajevo, and it was co-sponsored by the War Childhood Museum, and that's something that shouldn't exist, but that's a big organization there. And the conference was from October 6th to October 10th. And many of our members are Israeli and Palestinian educators who've been working together on peace education programs for decades. They were in Sarajevo, except for one who we got word was missing before she got her flight. So they were, it was definitely an emotional conference. I'm still processing it, actually, because here we were in a place that had, been torn apart by war, a place where politicians can't agree on anything, where Serbs, Croats, and Bosnians go to separate schools, and sometimes even in the same building, where museums in the city are dedicated to genocide, crimes against humanity, and childhood experiences of war. And, walking around there, you still see bullet holes in the buildings. And, people express their fears that they feel that they're still living every day on the brink of war. And then on October 7th, with the news, we had the reality of another war breaking out. And many of our colleagues were then wondering if and when they'd be able to return to their families. So all of this was going on. At the end of the conference, the last plenary session, we asked ourselves, are we making a difference? Is peace possible? In this room with a couple hundred people, we were just all silent for a while. And, of course, we have to go on. We can't stay silent. We have to return to our mission of trying to build resilience to the propaganda that divides people. And, just so many things that we were talking about at the conference. So that's why I'm here today, because we just have to keep moving forward with this work. And I'm not going to be able to offer any, foolproof formulas for having the, talking about humanitarian crises in your classrooms, but I hope to give you some things to think about. So I kind of divided my ideas into 4 different topics. One is teacher reflection, some questions that we need to be asking ourselves. The second one is about making connections to our content in the classroom. The third is a few considerations about interactional strategies, and then a couple ideas about promoting healthy conflict and constructive dialogue in the classroom. All right, so the first one is teacher reflection. And every time I see a list of resources of what we can do in our classrooms, and really good resources, the Schreier Institute, for example, has, a lot of good resources, but nobody talks about the teachers, about what we need to be thinking before we step into the classroom. This is part of the process that's often overlooked. And I think we need to ask ourselves a lot of questions and maybe create spaces where we can have these conversations amongst ourselves. For example, how do you think your students are impacted by this crisis? And how do you know it? What's signaling to you? Are they telling you directly, or are you assuming things or picking up on some cues? But just thinking about what you think the impact will be. What resources do we have on campus to share with our students? That's something that Bonnie, has made sure is all in one place for us. So we have a lot of links to resources. What resources for us as teachers? What's there for students? How can we get that information to them? A big question is, what's your emotional investment in this crisis? Is it something that you can talk about, or is it something that you can talk about? We have to work through this. How does this crisis relate directly or indirectly to our areas of expertise? And what aspects then of the crisis do you feel comfortable talking about? There might be some things that you don't want to talk about because you don't have the expertise. And I think we have to know those limits. We have to know those parameters for ourselves. We have to know where our expertise begins and ends. For example, I talk about language and culture. And of course, everything I talk about is embedded in, like I said, social, society, history, and politics, but I don't profess to be a political scientist. So I'll only take things so far, as long as it's still connected to my content. But we have to ask ourselves these questions and think about what we want to be prepared to talk about. And I think it's also, we need to think about how we can help each other, because we can maybe go into each other's classrooms and share our expertise in areas that we're not the most comfortable with. Next thing is thinking more about what conversations could be really productive learning experiences in your classes, and how what's going on, whatever it is you want to talk about, relates to the content of your course. So again, thinking about where does your expertise begin and end, and where do you, if you, like I said, I'm not a political scientist, so I won't go in depth with students about that. It's not my area, but I can bring issues back to language and culture and what the class is about. What specific content from our classes can relate to a crisis, or an aspect of it. So it might be just one aspect, something that we want to talk about. So we don't feel as if you have to cover an entire topic. You might just say, part of what's going on in this place, this time, is related to this part of our class. And so let's dig deeper into that. You can also, important thing I think is to model personal professional knowledge. And what I mean by that is how something relates to who you are as a professional, and maybe your personal experiences that have impacted your own learning and professional identity. I think if we can take our own experiences, but show students how we use them to develop our intellectual curiosity or learn about something, that's a good model for them. So for example, I came back from Sarajevo, and I just didn't even know what to think. I'm still processing it. And I came back one evening and had to teach the next day. So I couldn't sleep. So I thought, I have to talk about this. I have to talk about what went on in class, to my classes. And my classes are language and social justice. So it wasn't very difficult to relate the experiences that I had gone through to the class. But I wanted to make sure that I did it in a very mindful way. So I put some photographs up on a slideshow, and I talked to the students about what the conference was about, what we learned from each other. I talked to them about the collaborations that were very important, educational initiatives and work done by Israeli and Palestinian educators, and how they've been working together for decades. And the students' reactions were remarkable. They had so many questions, and we had no clear answers, but they had so many great questions, and we had a great conversation. I also was able to share with them, and I thought, with all the conferences that, we all go to, when we come back, do we share that with our students? And so they liked hearing about why I was there and other things that I was doing. But I think that can be a good role model to talk to our students about how events and crises impact us as professionals, and what that means, and how it helps develop our intellectual dimensions, so that they can hopefully develop a curiosity also. Okay, so next thing I want to mention is interactional strategies. And I think that there are a lot of places, again, the Schreier Institute and other websites, where you can get some specific, do's and don'ts and lists that are useful to look through. But I think one of the underlying principles is thinking about the purpose of a discussion, the purpose of a talk, and it has to be for understanding and learning. It's not about attacking or winning a debate. It has to be because there's something to understand or something to learn. So when I shared my experience in Sarajevo with my students, is because I learned so much there, and I knew that, and I started to understand things in a different way. And we need to model that process, that we can always be learning and trying to understand more about a topic. We don't have to arrive at a point where somebody wins the conversation. Okay, that's not the point. Next thing is to remember to respond with really non-judgmental statements. So I know Pierce and I have had conversations about this, of what to say when a student says something that's, not mean or terrible, but just uninformed. And you don't, you know, you want to take the focus off the student and zoom out. So if the student says something, you don't just say to that student, why do you think that? But instead you come further out and think and say maybe to the class, so what's the foundation of that argument? What would the foundation of the opposite side be? Where do you see overlap between these two sides? So bring it out farther and ask more general questions to get students talking about different perspectives and gray areas. I think that we can't be afraid of the gray areas. Now, we also know that you get sometimes unwelcome remarks and somebody might say something that's hateful or hostile. In intercultural education, that question always comes up. What do? You shut it down. You know, you know, as a teacher, like if somebody says something that's really inappropriate and really hurtful, that has to be shut down, not in a mean way, but just in a, okay, this is not the time or place to talk about that, or we can talk about that after class when you move on to the next thing. So sometimes we have to do that. Sometimes you have to avoid hostilities, but most of the time we run into situations where a student says something that's uninformed, naive, or they're just expressing a popular opinion based on a common mythology. And that's a great time to unpack that mythology and think, why do people think this? And again, maybe zoom out a little bit. So you're not just talking about that one student's remark, but think about, so why do so many people associate this group with this stereotype, right? And we talk about media. That's where media comes into what I do, but I won't get into detail of that today. But media can be a great catalyst for conversations to take the focus off the students and put it on something that is a fictional character from someplace. So I've got plenty of ideas for that for another time. Model good communication, avoiding binaries, or even avoiding words like saying all or every or most if it's anecdotal. Accept messiness, accept contradictions, understand that contradictions and complexities are obviously part of human condition. It's also part of our histories and our societies, and we need to accept that. Listen, suspend judgment, and I think another important part of the classroom is modeling forgiveness when mistakes are made. So communication is complex. We all know that. It involves, intentions, interpretations, everything that mediates it, language and nonverbal behaviors. There's so many misunderstandings can occur, and they do, whether it's an intercultural issue or just interpersonal. But forgiveness and repair are, again, something that's overlooked and we don't talk about enough, is that we have to learn to repair misunderstandings. And we can model that in our classrooms. Okay, I'm going to just next just talk about a couple different examples of promoting healthy conflict and constructive dialogue in a classroom. And I do understand that not everybody can make a direct connection between the content of what you're teaching and maybe something that's going on in the world. But if you feel that you need to give the students a space to talk about something, there are ways that you can do it. One of them is called the art of listening. And this is just a simple exercise where students are in groups of 4 or 5, and they each have to speak, you time 90 seconds and, on a topic. So you could say the topic is immigration, and they have to talk about that for 90 seconds. Nobody else in the group can interrupt, and other people just have to listen. And it's amazing how hard it is to listen for 90 seconds and not interrupt. So the students learn a little bit about themselves, about how they're maybe not good listeners, but we all have that problem. So that's one thing. Another one is kind of variation of a dialogue where you could do this in a larger group, but you propose a topic. Again, I'll just use immigration. That's something that I talk about in my classes. And you go around very quickly. The students have to just give a 1 or 2 word association. What do they think of first when they hear that word? Then the next round, they have to say what their concerns are about that topic, not their opinions, not what they know about it, but what concerns them about that topic. And then the round three, what questions do you have about it? But that second round where they express their concerns about something, they really learn a lot about each other, you know, like I'm afraid of this happening, or I'm afraid of that. So that might be one way to bring up some conversations. That has to be done carefully. And I think probably what Piers is going to talk about would relate to that. You don't want to force students to bring up something traumatic, but it does give it a chance to voice some concerns. I use media work where I have students do linguistic landscape work. So for example, I might say to them, what does inclusivity look like? Go take photos of it. And they think, what? And then, you know, we talk about it, and I create a Padlet, and or someplace, a platform where they can post photographs. So you can do this with anything. You can say, what does patriotism look like? What does, we did a few years ago, woke, as the meaning of that word was changing and shifting. What does woke look like? Right? So they came back with all kinds of different things to talk about. But you can do this with a lot of different things. What does culture look like? What does marriage look like? What does peace look like? And they usually, then they have a lot of things to say about it. They have to talk about why they chose that. Another thing I do is more related to media literacy and looking at propaganda. I take pictures everywhere I go. And actually I have some propaganda from Sarajevo that was, it was very, very powerful. And so I looked at that with my students because that related directly to class. We were talking about language and semiotics and choices like that. You can go to something like Today's Front Pages, which if you're not familiar with it, it used to be part of the Newseum, which is no longer in Washington, D.C., but they still have an online presence. And if you Google Today's Front Pages, you can see the front page daily. It only stays up for one day, and it's only the front page of hundreds of newspapers from around the world. But you can work with those headlines and see how is, you know, this newspaper in this town representing the certain story compared to another newspaper. And you can just kind of, and that's something that you can do quickly because you don't really have access to the entire newspaper, except if you go to the library and do that. So this is actually the perfect segue into the next speaker, looking at, you know, researching things more.
Yeah, thank you. I was going to say, I literally have a website that I'm going to show everyone called Access World News, where you can, yes, access world news. Well, thank you very much, Carla. Give me just a second here. I'm going to bring up some slides that I made. All right, can everyone see that okay? Great. All right, so hello again. My name is Kevin Sieber, and as Bonnie mentioned in the introduction, and thank you for that lovely introduction, Bonnie, and for putting all this together. And thank you to my co-presenters on this panel, and to all of you for coming on a sunny Friday afternoon. My name is Kevin Sieber. I'm the head librarian at Penn State Abington. I have been here for 8 months and 2 days, so I'm still very new to Penn State and the community, but I think this is a really important topic and something I was really excited to talk about with you all. So just digging into this a little bit about me. So I'm a librarian, and we haven't always done a great job in our profession of explaining what we do and what we've been doing lately. But specifically, I'm what's called an instruction librarian, a teaching librarian. I have done a lot of research in an area generally called information literacy, but my focus is on information retrieval systems and information seeking behavior. So what do people type into search boxes? What do they expect to find? What does the search box do when it gives them results? Is something that I've been working on for a while. And it's infinitely fascinating if you ever want to talk about it. But a lot of what I also look at is how people interpret information and how they look at different sources of information. So as we're talking about this and doing research during times of crisis, we want to use credible information. Excuse me, I'm getting over a head cold, so I might need to take a couple of pauses. But we want to use credible information. We want our students using credible, reliable, authoritative information. But we need to talk about that for a second, because when we talk about credibility, I think a lot about different kinds of information, but more or less across the board, the thing that makes something credible is the underlying process that produced it. And when we talk about those processes, it's things like research, it's editing, it's data collection, it's data analysis, it's a good literature review, it's peer review, it's having a good editorial board for your paper. There are all sorts of different things that go into making good information, whether it's academic, popular media, whatever it is. But that requires labor and time. It is expensive to make good information in a lot of cases. And when we think about how we access information and we operate, we have to understand that most of the places that we get our information from are companies. They're charged with making money. So we're in an information economy that can either grow revenue or cut labor costs. And when I say our information economy, this is the one that's been going on since roughly the 17th century of producing information that is sold to people. And they're trying to do that as inexpensively as they can with the widest impact on the community. So they're trying to make it easier, to make it less expensive for them to create information. And as they do that, they put an emphasis on things that are new. This idea, I know newspapers aren't really around anymore, but bear with me for a second. There was a time not that long ago where we would pay money for a newspaper, right? Every day people would want that newspaper. And the following day, that same newspaper would be trash. We use this term in English of that's old news, that's yesterday's news, to describe things that aren't particularly valuable. But there's nothing in that information that made it valuable one day. Like in that paper, the next day it didn't cease being information. But what has been conveyed to us is the value is not the information itself, it's that it's new information, hence the name new, apostrophe, or excuse me, plural of new is news. This is amazing marketing campaign that was put together hundreds of years ago. But we even see this now, that so much of our media puts an emphasis on breaking news, live updates. That's happened within traditional media, and it happens within social media. So if you look at X, formerly Twitter, like you go to their page, it's somewhat dystopian. It's happening now, join today. They're putting an emphasis on what is live and happening in real time. Same thing with TikTok. They put a big emphasis on what is being live streamed. So traditional media, social media, everybody's looking to move quickly and present new things. The problem is that a lot of this information that is being produced, and I'm putting information in quotes because it's not particularly informative, because it doesn't have any context. If you're just presented with images or firsthand accounts that are not appropriately contextualized, you don't understand it. It may elicit an emotional response, a visceral response, but if you don't have an understanding of the broader story around it, it doesn't necessarily inform people. And that is something that our media has really been doing for a while, and it has escalated quite a bit in the last few decades, is we're not getting something that's well researched, we get a lot more spectacle. So for example, the perennial example is the person standing in a hurricane, right? This is not particularly informative. So every time there's a hurricane, I'm from Florida, I grew up in Florida, my family is still in Florida. Hurricanes hit Florida, and this is Jim Cantori from the Weather Channel, gripping Street Post. This doesn't tell you if you should evacuate. This doesn't tell you if your place of business or your school is going to be okay next week. Doesn't tell you if the insurance companies are planning on reimbursing people for damages. It's good television, but it's not particularly informative. But this is presented as up to the minute. We're on the ground. We are presenting you with what is really happening. And absent that context, it's not particularly useful. So that is something, there is certainly value to firsthand accounts and lived experience. I'm not saying those are uniformly not useful, but they need to be situated in as part of a broader understanding that we have of topics. Because absent that, it's just data. It's not information. It's something where you can't learn from it. And when we talk about times of crisis, and that's what's brought us all here now, is during times of crisis, we get emotional. There are a lot of emotions that come with that. Anxiety and stress, two of the primary ones. And I know I do this, many people do this, is in times of stress, we tend to seek out information because, generally speaking, when we have questions, we look for information to solve our problems, answer our questions. And especially when we're stressed, we'll look for more and more information. And there's this feeling, if we just keep searching, if we keep reading, if we look at every picture, everything on social media, if we keep refreshing our timeline, maybe we'll get an answer. So this isn't like a formal term, but this is sometimes referred to as infomania. I would say this is connected to doom scrolling, the term that came up during the pandemic of people just continually going to social media trying to get answers. So for me, I do this going back to hurricanes, right? When a hurricane hits Florida, I am on social media refreshing my timeline. I'm looking at the National Hurricane Center, which updates every few hours. I'm on YouTube live streaming the local news channel because it's the one I grew up with and I trust it. I'm looking at national news stories, local news stories. I'm refreshing all of these things. I'm curious, where's the storm making landfall? What are its wind speeds? What is the pressure in the eye of the storm? What is the storm surge? What are the evacuation zones? All of that is me collecting information, trying to get some sense of control. But the real information need that I have in that context is my mom going to be okay? And none of that stuff answers it, but it doesn't prevent me from seeking out information. So when we're in these heightened emotional states and we're dealing with so many of the things that are in the world, and thinking about the comments that people presented at the beginning of this, trying to create a sense of calm, there's this feeling of if we inform ourselves, that will help calm us. But as we're trying to get up to the second information, you got to remember where I started this, is that the most reliable, the credible, the good information takes labor and it takes time. So this is one of those things that it is helpful to just take a minute to step back, sometimes take a day and step back. And that's something that's not necessarily how we do things within this economy, within our culture, globally. So my advice to you all as teachers in this moment is to talk to your students about what good information is to you in your classroom, in your discipline, in your life. Maybe it's the things that you read personally. Maybe it's the things that your discipline values. But talk about what makes it good. Don't just say, use good, reliable, authoritative information. Talk about those processes. Talk about your experiences, your impressions. Because all of that, your views of what makes something good is informed by your research that you've done. And I really loved what Carla was talking about. Of the goal is, as we're going through and having conversations with people, is to learn more. We're not trying to necessarily win a conversation. We just want to know more about something. So as you know more about things, presenting that to students so that they have a better understanding. Because as best as I can tell, there are no easy solutions in this area. It just comes from reading a lot and living a lot and thinking about what you've read, the conversations that you've had. So that's my advice for you all as teachers. My advice for all of us as humans is to just be patient. Taking time to learn more, to establish some context, even if it's an area with which you're familiar, just taking a little bit of time to read a little bit more. And that seems very difficult because, especially in times of crisis, every website in the world, as far as I can tell right now, has a header that says live updates. And from different crises from all over the place, live updates on Ukraine, live updates on Gaza, Israel, live updates on Maine. So there's always this push in the media that we consume that you need up to the second information. That isn't always the most informative thing. So I think in practice, a good strategy is to read widely and try to engage with multiple viewpoints. Again, what Carla was just saying, I'm going to talk more about this in just a second. And also remember that there is information outside of social media. And a lot of what I'm presenting here is sort of old hat. It may seem obvious, but I think it's a good reminder when we're stressed that there are other ways of communicating, and there are other ways of accessing viewpoints of people without necessarily going to social media. Because, again, social media puts an emphasis on newness, and there's also the algorithms behind that put an emphasis on winning the conversation, like Carla was saying, that a lot more of what we see is more combative than information that seeks to be educational. And as we're talking about different viewpoints, I just want to point out all information is biased because it's made by people, and all people are biased. The goal when you're doing research, when you talk about this with students, is not to find unbiased information. That doesn't happen. It's to identify the bias of that information. And bias on its face is not a bad thing. It's just the humanity of it. And to that point, all of us, all receivers of information are biased, and we cannot remove the lens through which we see the world. You know, our perceptions are driven by our experiences, our reflections on those experiences. So think about your own bias as well as you're going through. And as you read more and as you learn more, your bias will shift. That goes for us, that goes for our students, that goes for everybody. But it's important to be thoughtful about how you're going through and accessing information. But as I said before, there's not an easy solution for all of these things as you're doing research during times of crisis. But the best thing I can think of for us, for our students, for our communities, is kindness, patience, humility, and just taking a step back and not trying to figure everything out all at once. I did want to show, as a librarian, I'm obligated to do one point and click demonstration because this is what we do so often. So just very quickly, I wanted to show you something from the library website, and then I'm going to talk about Wikipedia. So give me just a second here. Okay, so now you're looking at the library website, right? Right, okay. So this is the Penn State University Library's website. We collect tons of money from students and we give millions of dollars to different companies that make information available. So just after today, if you have any questions about locating information about any viewpoint, any data set, historical information, current information, whatever it is, on our website where it says Ask a Librarian, that's where you go to get help. But the thing I wanted to show is we have a database. So if you click on databases, it's something called Access World News. I already have it open here. And this thing is great because this has newspapers from all over the world. Generally speaking, just about everything is available in English. So as you're working with your students, they don't need to be fluent in several languages. I know many of our students are, but this is a way that you can quickly compare coverage of a story from different countries from around the world. So there's a map where you can browse things. There's also lists of just regions of the world. When you click on one, they will then provide you with countries within there, within that region. And then they'll say where it says sources. So for Israel and Palestine, since they're in the news right now, 34 sources. And these are, in some cases, it's BBC reports that are published within Israel. In other cases, there are newspapers published within the Palestinian territories. There are papers published within Tel Aviv, Jerusalem. The Jerusalem Post is in here. For all of these different papers, there will be dates of access. So in some cases, we'll have 20, 30, 40 years of news reporting available for you and your students to access. Not everything is current. In some cases, as we know, newspapers do go out of business and that sort of thing. But this is a very easy way, regardless of what the issue is. If you just want to compare international coverage of an event and have your students very quickly see what do the Germans think about the American economy versus what do the French think, this is a way to do that and get a lot of different viewpoints. Again, it's not that these are unbiased reports. It's just you're going to see biases of different countries, different regions within countries. But as we also know, just from the United States, not every news source within one country or one region reflects the same bias. So this is a way to talk about those differences. And again, a lot of what Carl was talking about is just exactly the things I'm thinking about. So that's the library piece of this. It's called Access World News. The other thing I want to talk about very briefly is Wikipedia. And I know, not everybody has a great opinion of Wikipedia. I think it's very powerful for a lot of different reasons. But this is the Wikipedia page for Gaza. And this, more specifically, is the English language Wikipedia page. So whenever you look at Wikipedia in English, it'll start with en.wikipedia.org. And this is a thing that I don't know a lot of people know, is that Wikipedia is available in lots of different languages, but the versions of the pages from different languages are not literal translations from one to the next. So the French Wikipedia page for Pennsylvania is not the English Wikipedia page for Pennsylvania in translation. It was written by people who were writing in French. So it's going to reflect a bias of people from France, Montreal, the Caribbean, Africa. People who are writing and speaking in French are the people who would have been editing that page. So this is the Wikipedia page for Gaza in English. Generally speaking, the English Wikipedia reflects an American bias, an American Canadian, UK bias, Western European bias. But up here, every Wikipedia page has one of these. You can see it says 130 languages. That means there are 130 different versions of the Wikipedia page for Gaza. You can click that. All of the different languages will be available to you. So I've selected, this is now the Arabic version of the Wikipedia page in Gaza. So this was written by people who are researching and writing in Arabic. And I'm using Google Chrome, and it automatically pops up with an option that says, would you like to read this in English? And I click that. And this is now a perspective of Gaza, Wikipedia page on Gaza that was written by people in Arabic. It's machine translation. It's not perfect. It's pretty good, and it's getting better all the time. So this is a way that you and your students, if you want just an introduction to a topic that you're not that familiar with, it's Wikipedia. It's meant to be introductory. It'll link to other pages where you can learn more about a topic. And in the sense of like, there's two sides to any issue. There are ways of any topic that if you want to read about climate change from a Japanese perspective compared with a German perspective, compared with a written in Portuguese, it would be both Brazilian and Portugal. So it's not necessarily tied to a specific country, it's tied to a specific language. But this is a very quick and easy way for you and your students to get a broader sense of how a conversation might be presented differently around the world. So that's what I want to focus on, is just a couple of resources, but just generally at this time. I know it's very difficult, but taking a step back is generally a good idea in most cases. And in terms of how information is produced, we've put so much of an emphasis on fast and now that taking a step back has to be a deliberate move. So thanks very much. And with that, I'll turn it over to Piers.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for being here today. And I'm going to apologize to a couple of you who I see in the group who have already heard a little bit about trauma-aware pedagogy from me, and a couple of people who are actually in a year-long exploration of that topic with me last year. So this will be a lot of the same stuff that we've already spoken about in the past. Let me get my slide here going. Okay, so this is a brief introduction to trauma-aware pedagogy, which is a very large topic with a lot of different opinions and a lot of different voices. What I'm going to talk about today is sort of a result of, like I mentioned, a year-long exploration of TAP that we did with a faculty group at Abington last year. We had a number of speakers come. We had a lot of reading recommendations and some experimentation in the classroom. And so I'm sort of reporting on the bigger picture in a nutshell in a very short amount of time. And the reason, of course, that I'm doing that is because of the situation that is taking place right now in the Middle East and the potential trauma that students and faculty and staff and other members of our community are experiencing around that. But a lot of what I'm going to talk about here has much larger implications, and I'll get into that in a little bit. So the first thing I wanted to kind of talk about, or the first thing I wanted to start us off with, is that trauma-aware pedagogy is not a specific set of techniques. It's not like there's like, here, these 5 things that you need to do, and you'll have a trauma-aware classroom. It's a mindset, and actually it's a heart set. And so what I mean by that is, you know, as academics, we are, rightly so, very much concerned with information, with data, with research, with presenting that information to students, with consuming that information ourselves. And so all of the things that we've been talking about so far today are absolutely 100% critical to the mission that we have as instructors. But the point I want to make is that it can be sometimes, I know this myself, it can be sometimes that we find ourselves so immersed in the information, so immersed in the intellectual thinking about the information, that we lose contact with our hearts. And so kind of what I want to start off with today is just bringing us back into our hearts, into our bodies, into our experience as human beings, embodied human beings in a space. It's a virtual space, but we're all in our bodies wherever we are. And to really sort of like sink back into our hearts as we explore what trauma aware pedagogy is all about. So the crisis that is taking place in the Middle East right now is not happening in a vacuum. It's taking place, at a time where students and faculty and staff and members of our communities have been experiencing a lot of difficulties, a lot of complex crises, a lot of events that could be producing trauma for many of us, and they've been coming faster and faster, one on top of the other for the last several years. So I just have some of the highlights here on this slide. There's many other global, national, local, and also personal traumas that people have been experiencing for years, and this is just kind of like the latest sort of like shockwave in that larger context. So I wanted to give you just a little bit of statistics to think about how these kinds of events have been affecting our students. So this is a series of charts that were put together by the Center for Collegiate Mental Health, a report that they put together in 2021. And they surveyed 150,000 students who were using CAP centers, so counseling and psychological services centers across 180 higher ed institutions in the US. And what they showed in the study was that the incidence of students reporting all sorts of different traumatic experiences had increased significantly over the previous decade. And so I'm giving you a couple of the statistics here related to sexual trauma, harassment, and other kinds of abusive behavior, and then just like general traumatic events all having increased. So I have stats from Karen Gould at Abington CAP Center that relate to our campus. And I know not everybody here is from the Abington campus, so I wasn't going to kind of get into the details with those. But for those of you who are from Abington, as one of as the most diverse campus in the Penn State system, our students overwhelmingly are in using CAP centers are overwhelmingly people of color, and they're actually reporting even higher rate of trauma on these same metrics than the CCMH report. So I don't have those same statistics for other campuses. It would be something maybe interesting to look into for other campuses, but at least as far as Abington is concerned, the numbers are significantly higher than the percentages that you see here. Right, so that means that we have, across our campuses across the country, we have tens of thousands of students that are in college right now that are trying to succeed. They're trying to do well in school. They're trying to, change their lives and get out of whatever socioeconomic situation they're in order to move up in society, and they have big dreams and all of that. But they're also, tens of thousands of students are also dealing with pretty severe trauma on a daily basis that they bring into the classrooms with them. And an event like what we're experiencing right now in the Middle East is, going to very significantly affect some students. Some students might not even know what's going on, but other students will be very significantly affected by this. And recently, I've had students in my classroom who are Jewish, who are Palestinian, who are from Turkey, and they just had, massive earthquakes there. They're from Ukraine, they're from Russia, they're from China, they're from a lot of different contexts, either international students or students whose parents immigrated or they immigrated, and they're aware of all of these traumas going on right now. And they're coming into the classroom. And they're sitting down in my classroom, in our classrooms. They've just come in on the train from Philly, or they've just, come driven in from wherever they live, and they're sitting in our classrooms. And we're expecting them to think, use their brains, understand information, process, read stuff, memorize stuff, take exams and so on and so forth. And I think all of that is super important, as I said earlier, but I think we're forgetting about their embodied experience, or at least I often in the past was forgetting that they're embodied people that are sitting in this classroom with all of this trauma in their bodies and in their experience, and they may even have experienced it just right before coming to the classroom. And how is it possible that they're going to be able to sit there and learn? So something that trauma-aware pedagogy has been focused on is looking at the effects on learning of trauma. And I'm not going to get into that in detail because one of the talks that we had last year gets into some of that. And I'm going to give you a link at the end for accessing all of those talks. So I would really highly recommend looking at the one that relates to, the effects of trauma on the brain, the effects of trauma on learning. So the students are sitting in our classrooms, right, with all this trauma in their bodies, and we are, launching into this academic topic. One of the best things that we learn from the trauma-aware pedagogy in terms of techniques, in terms of things to do, is to build into your class, especially at the beginning, just a moment to kind of check in, to have students check in with their own embodied experience, with their own feelings, with their own emotions, and just kind of take stock of where they're at before we launch into the material. So I actually wanted to just kind of like invite us to do that here as a group. And we've been talking a lot about ideas, about information, and about communication. And like I said, all that's really important. But what we haven't done yet is really kind of like checked into our bodies and see like how are we actually feeling ourselves right now about this crisis or about the other crises that are going on, right? And so the technique is just to sort of like look inward into your own body and look at your own body sensations, and what are you experiencing right now as you think about whether it's the Middle East or other kinds of sources of tension and anxiety that you have in your own life right now. All right, so maybe I'll just take like a minute and invite people to check in.
And Pierce, during this time, can we unmute and then speak? Is that?
What I was going to do is just ask people to maybe like throw in the chat if you feel moved, not necessarily required, but if you feel moved to put something in the chat, just a couple words, just saying sort of like what do you experience when you take a moment, take a breath, kind of tune into your body. And maybe you're feeling great right now, and maybe you're not experiencing a lot of anxiety, a lot of trauma right now. It may be that some of the issues, just even talking about them here in this group, is getting you a little bit charged up, and that's something you can feel in your body. Maybe something completely unrelated to today's talk, but feel free to just throw a couple words in there. One thing that might be interesting to look for when you're checking in like this is if you're feeling resistance to the check-in, and oftentimes when you're kind of like in a zone where your mind is really churning, you have anxiety, there's resistance to checking into your body, and oh, this is stupid, or this is a waste of time, or I have more important things to do than this. Those kinds of thoughts can come up and create sort of a barrier to a check-in, and that's often a defense response to avoid feeling the trauma or avoid feeling anxiety, and that's something I found that both students as well as other people frequently experience this kind of like resistance to check-in. So if that's there, that can be something that you report too. I can't feel my body right now. I'm resistant to this, or I'm just not getting any sensation there because I'm too focused on other things. That's something else too. Yeah. So what I'm reading in the chat is that, you know, that that we're not just disembodied brains that are teaching our students how to think about current events. What I'm reading in the chat is that we also have our own um, emotions, we have our own reactions, we have our own feelings, and that we're bringing these into the classroom with us as well. So our students are coming in with all of their emotions, all of their feelings, and we're coming in with all of ours as well. And we're trying to enter into a space where some kind of constructive learning and conversation is going to happen, right? And the whole point of trauma-aware pedagogy, if you take one thing away from today, it's that you can't ignore all of the things that are going on beneath the surface. That's the main point, is how do we not ignore what's taking place beneath the surface as we enter into the classroom together. So I have some sort of common threads or common approaches or common, you know, ideas that came up, that bubbled up through our conversations last year, through the speakers, through the readings, through the conversations that we were having as faculty members, that I wanted to share with you. This is very, very introductory. And again, I'm going to point you to the videos and to the recommended readings to get more information about all of these, but just so that you can kind of get a flavor for what trauma-aware pedagogy has to offer us. I think it's really important to recognize that the kinds of things that we've been talking about as a profession, as instructors, for decades now, this is definitely not in replacement of, but it's actually building upon. Trauma-aware pedagogy can't really happen at all unless you're already enacting and taking very seriously diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, accessibility so that all students are able to participate fully in the classroom, diversifying the curriculum so that there's a wide range of different races and genders and perspectives and national origins and so forth represented in the syllabus. Active learning techniques that really allow students to play to their strengths in the classroom, and the focus on student success as being an important, you know, an important driver in the classroom. All of those things need to be in place for trauma-aware pedagogy to really be able to flourish. So that's sort of like the starting point, the baseline, the minimum prerequisites for doing trauma-aware pedagogy. And then what trauma-aware pedagogy does is it builds on top of that. So we're creating this inclusive and supportive and trustworthy learning environment. But now what we're really focusing on is making sure that students can really be seen for themselves and welcome themselves and empower themselves as individuals, each student individually in the classroom. And that the focus is turning from sort of like general groups, general populations, right? How do we help with larger groups of people to make our classes better, you know, suited, better fit, for better spaces for them? And now we're pivoting, you know, beyond the focus on groups, we're pivoting to focus specifically on individual people as full human beings. What is their experience like in my classroom as an individual person? Right. So in order to do that, what TAP is asking of us as instructors is really something radically different than at least what I was trained at in graduate school. Right. In my PhD program, we did not. Some of you maybe in the education field learned about some of these kinds of things, but the majority of us who did not train in an education program, you know, we didn't learn any of the above so far. And then on top of that, what TAP is really calling for is a position, a stance, or like I said, a heart set of radical compassion and transparency with your students, like really caring about students as individuals and being transparent with them about all of the process that you're going through and thinking through the structure of the class and thinking through grading and thinking through, you know, how things are affecting you, a kind of transparency with students that a lot of us aren't used to doing. And a radical presence, just really being like fully present in the classroom and really, you know, in your body, aware of what's happening around you, you know, and you're not yourself checked out, you know, in some kind of like thought loops where you're just kind of like on autopilot in the classroom. So TAP is asking for a lot. It's asking for you know, a big commitment, a radical commitment to how you show up in the classroom. And it's also asking for, you know, the alignment of all the stuff that you do in your teaching with those priorities. So, you know, complete restructuring of the syllabus, of the assignments, of basically every dimension of your course to really fit those priorities. So it's about at this point in my presentation where I think like most faculty are like, oh my God, I can't take this on. This is too much. There's no way I could do all that. You know, you might have felt that way back like 3 bullets ago. But what I want to reassure you of is that this does not need to be a process where you do it all like this week, you know, or even like next semester. But rather it's about gradually in a sustainable way that works for you, learning more about trauma-aware pedagogy and nudging your courses in that direction little by little. Could be you change one assignment for later this semester. It could be you incorporate one little exercise, you know, next week. It could be that you change, you know, you take some time over the break to rearrange some of your syllabus for next semester, right? It's just little bite-sized pieces of, you know, over time to align your teaching with trauma-aware principles. And then one of the things that's really easy though, that you can start like even tomorrow or this afternoon, if you're teaching this afternoon, is a small moment like what we did earlier, that small moment of check-in, small moments of, you know, mindfulness or self-reflection or embodied connection. There's a lot of different kind of words that you can use for the same thing. Really what we're talking about is allowing students to just kind of like land in the classroom. They just come in from whatever they've been doing, they're thinking about whatever they're thinking about, experiencing whatever they're experiencing about, land in the classroom, take a breath, take a moment to check in with their bodies. How are we feeling today? You know, in my class, I do a check-in like verbally, you know, how's everybody feeling today with some, you know, there may be some conversation about it, maybe like a quick thumbs up, thumbs down, thumbs in the middle kind of exercise. There's a lot of different ways to do this. No one size fits all, you know, no, the way I do it may not be right for you. But in some way, helping students to kind of like, you know, just kind of tap into their own embodied experience before you launch into the class. And frankly, for us too, like we just were driving in traffic. We were just, you know, running up from a faculty meeting, whatever we've been doing, we needed to land in the classroom, take a breath. Okay, I'm here. I'm present. I'm you know, ready to you know, to be present for my students, right? We need that check-in too. And so yeah, the last bullet here is really just to reiterate, you know, kind of to elaborate on what I just said, which is that TAP is really asking for a strong faculty commitment to self-care. And that is absolutely mandatory to be doing trauma-aware pedagogy because, you know, the famous saying, you got to put on your own oxygen mask before you put it on the kid next to you, right? So I think we heard that maybe like 3 or 4 times from different presenters during the TAP exploration. But so it's a little bit of a cliche, but it's actually true. Like, you know, you can't be there for your students and be, you know, holding space for their trauma if you yourself aren't you know, doing that kind of self-care. So that's another principle, basic principle of TAP. So I know I've been sort of like more abstract and not really talking about specific, you know, techniques or whatever, and that's because I only had a short amount of time. What I do have is a Canvas Pride that's dedicated to TAP. We don't use it to communicate. There's not like a bunch of spam that you're going to get. It's just a place to post links of the videos that from the speakers that came. And if we have speakers come in the future, we'll continue to put them there. A lot of recommended readings and other kinds of resources. The other thing I would say is I'm really happy to meet with anybody, just, you know, not as like an official consultant, but just as a, you know, colleague and friend. If anybody wants to talk about some of the things that I'm doing in my classroom or things that other people are doing in their classroom, just send me an email. It's just my last name, salguero@psu.edu. I'm also happy to hook you up with one of the other people who were in that faculty cohort. There was about six people or so that participated in that may have perspectives different than mine that you could you know, reach out to as well. So just get in touch. I'm happy to connect you in whatever way makes sense for you with this topic. And we can, I'm not an expert in trauma pedagogy. It's something I'm learning, something I'm interested in learning. And so, if you're interested in learning along with me, would invite you to do so. So I'm going to stop my share there. And maybe I'll just throw my email in the chat just in case you missed it. And yeah, thank you very much. And Bonnie, I wanted to thank you for doing this event. I think it's hard to throw things together quickly and have many people show up and have it be successful and have it be helpful. So really, yeah, great job, kudos, and thank you to everybody.
Thank you. Thank you so much to all of our speakers. This is always intended as a starting place and not an ending place to the work that we're doing here, recognizing that as we all wrestle with how to best approach things as practitioners or in service to students in any capacity on a campus, I really appreciate you all as colleagues thinking about what forms that takes on. I think that's really significant. And one of the things as I was sort of listening along and taking notes, I hope that it wasn't too distracting that I was putting notes sort of in the comments as I went through. It's my first time trying to do that. It was something that was suggested to me as a point of accessibility as we focus in and across different things, thinking about how attention works. In my case, sometimes doesn't work. Having those notes to refocus us was the goal. So given the time that we have, rather than thinking across the panel members and some of their, I would say, consistent points about especially learning together and modeling learning for students. And the other thing that really struck me across the points of our colleagues today was the idea of being humble, right? So I do have a background in education. And one of the things that I ask my students every semester is, how many of you had a really amazing teacher that you just loved at some point in your pre-K to 12 and higher education experience? And everyone sort of, raises their hand. Most people have at least one person that they really appreciated in education. And I say, okay, well, how many of you had somebody that you didn't really like? There's some sort of tension that happened there. And pretty much everybody raises their hand. And there are a couple of things that I discuss with my classes about that. And the first is that part of what we don't do well as educators sometimes is apologize, right? It's the ability to say, yeah, I'm sorry, that didn't come across as I had intended. And that's something I really appreciate that the panelists, many of you touched on today, was the idea of just being able to take a step back and say, hey, that wasn't my intention. Really sorry. It's just the ability to do that. It seems lost on the profession. And the other thing that I tend to talk to my students about is, as much as you all might feel that as students, on the other hand, as practitioners, we always have that one student. I taught K-12 for over a decade, where you just think like, oh, okay, so-and-so is absent today. My life might be a little easier. And at first my students look at me and I say, I know you might think that the point of a teacher is to really love all kids, and that's impossible. We all have different personalities that we come into. And every so once in a while, you'll have that student that you didn't really like very much, but then they come back to you and they'll say, I loved your class. It was the best class. And you're thinking, were we in the same room together? I don't understand how you loved this. I didn't like the experience with you. And as an educator, sometimes that feels good. Like, oh, I accidentally helped somebody in a way that I didn't intend. And for every time that we have accidentally helped students, I think we can also accidentally harm students. And so to note that even in our best of intentions, there can be accidental harm that's caused, which is something that I heard also across these presentations today. And then how we wrestle with that too as educators and as a community, I think is important. So with the 9 minutes or so left today, I do want to open it up to the folks here, knowing that you might walk away and have other thoughts or ideas at some other point in time. But if you have things to perhaps share, I'm going to just go back and in the chat put the Slido from earlier in case you want to reflect on those ideas that we all had at the beginning. And you can either put questions in the chats if you don't want to put it to everybody, if you want to just pose it to me and then I can rephrase, that's fine. Or you can unmute and we can just have a conversation.
There's I'd like to add something to what you just said, Bonnie, because the result sometimes of not modeling things like forgiveness or the fact that we make mistakes or things happen accidentally, is that people don't want to talk. Students learn to avoid conversations because they're so afraid of making a mistake. And we have to recognize that we make mistakes as human beings. And like I said, we can try to repair them, because there's a difference between making a mistake and intentionally saying something that's, hurtful or unkind. But yeah, so we have to show students that there's room for making some mistakes. And it's not like that happens constantly, but we have to let it happen and talk about it.
So I do have one question here. It's like, could the panelists please share some thoughts or expand upon what they do when a student says they've been harmed by a teacher or professor, by something that a teacher or professor said or did?
I guess I've been at Penn State 25 years, and I've had students disclose different things to me. And now we have different protocols that we have to follow, but we didn't always have those things in place. So I remember, 20 years ago being kind of confused about, what do I do with this information? This is not good. I talked to colleagues and who reached out, somebody who was in a better position than I was, to deal with issues, and they reached out to the student and talked to the student. So there are different, but I think there are different protocols to follow today in terms of, it depends on the type of information it is. Did the teachers say something, or was it an action? I mean, it's a really complicated question. I don't know if Kevin or Pierce have dealt with that.
Yeah, I have, and you're right. I mean, there's a whole spectrum of things that students could be identifying as being harmful. I would say across the board, no matter what they've just told me, the first thing that I do is to validate their feeling that they were harmed. That would be like the one thing that I do for across the board for all of them. And then what to do next depends on what they've just told me. If they've told me something that it sounds to me like sound pedagogy, like, they're really mad at their professor for, like, the way that the syllabus was written or something like that, then I still validate them, but then it's kind of like I talk about the pedagogical value of that or something like that, and try to like explain, maybe the professor wasn't doing the transparency that I do with my students, and try to like explain like why that policy might exist or something like that, and encourage them to talk to the professor. So that's like, down on this end of the spectrum. Going a little bit further down the, to the other end of the spectrum, I have invited students to, or I guess offered to mediate, or to report, or to talk to the division head, or to take the next step for them, or empower them by telling them who they should report to. So that's like the next step. And then, yeah, what you're talking about is like full on, like, ethical breach that needs to be reported. That's a whole other kind of official reporting process. And sometimes students don't really understand like where on that spectrum what they've experienced falls. And so talking with them to try to help them understand that is something I've done too. And the leaf blowers have shown up at my house, so I don't know if I can't hear anything. I don't know if you can hear them, but I'm gonna mute.
So I did put also in the chat, the Office of Ethics and Compliance through University Park also has a bias reporting system. And that's one place where students can have a voice as well. There's another question here. If really appreciate this panel. Wondering if you and the panel has advice or tips on ways to redirect or address students who take a lot of space, and not in a good way, in the classroom, so that we make space for more voices and perspectives.
One thing, and I meant to mention this during my presentation, I talked a lot about reading rather than having conversations. And that's something, it's not just because I work in a building full of books. I think especially when people are interacting with new information, if they can read it on their own and go through those initial reactions to something that they find shocking or offensive, to do that on their own first, so that their initial reaction isn't, hey, can you tell me, asking someone to their face, tell me about your perspective, person from this culture, and then reacting to them. So I think that something similar could be applied to students who do take up space in class, that assigning reading and having people reflect on that in writing. I think there's certainly a value to having in-person and in-class discussions, for sure. But I think, I don't know. I sometimes wonder if not as much reading and writing has been assigned. And I think in some ways, especially as you're interacting with the kinds of information you perhaps haven't seen before, cultures you haven't seen before, the idea of interacting with, doing the labor of reading what somebody else has already prepared, can be a way to encourage people to do some work on their own time rather than in front of everybody else.
Yeah, and just to build on that, so sometimes, like I've found in one class right now that, yeah, there are a few students who are really trying to dominate the conversation. So I get the conversation started with a very short reading as a homework assignment, and students have to, in a discussion group, post their ideas. Then sometimes I print it out because I just can't look at screens all day. And I go through their main ideas. And when I walk into class, I call on the students who are quiet, and I say, okay, so you mentioned this in your comments. So like Kevin said, you give them something to start with. So it's not a cold call of tell me your opinion, but they've already written about it. And then I make sure that I address them by their names and connect to something that they've said. And usually what I try to do too is say, John over here made a really good point in the discussion. Let's talk about that. And then that makes John, who's been quiet, talking. And so that's one way to try to redirect some of the contributions from students.
Yeah, so I would say in my classroom, I always use hand raising. I guess you could use like baton passing too, just so that there's like the people aren't speaking over each other and there's like some control to the flow of the classroom. And so when there's a student that's like constantly like sitting in the front, raising their hand every single time, I take them aside and I just really thank them for their enthusiasm for the class and just like their amazing participation. I said, this is fabulous. Like, you're going to learn a lot in this class. You're doing everything right. However, I'm going to always prioritize people who haven't spoken yet. And if somebody's new is raising their hand, they're going to get called on first. And so just know, I see you raising your hand. You're awesome. But I'm going to prioritize other people, and we'll get around to you too. We'll hear from you as well. But there's going to be a flow that prioritizes the people that haven't spoken as much, and then I kind of make a point of making that clear during the class as well, so that the students know that they'll get called on if they raise their hands. But I never turn it into a negative, because that even if the student is taking up space in a bad way, class participation is hard to come by, and it's a great thing. So yeah, so anyway, that's what I do.
And one of the things that I've been working on with the Difficult Conversation series that I offer here on our campus is giving folks the tools to really evaluate what kind of an interruption is it, and then thinking through what it actually means to be an ally, an accomplice, or a co-conspirator in and across situations. So if anyone's interested in that, please feel free to email me. I'm happy to share any materials that I've come up with, just as a way. Usually I've been putting them on our Inclusive Excellence webpage. It's not 100% developed yet, so I haven't published it, but I'm happy to share those resources. And with those resources talks about what type of an interruption it is, and then different ways that you could respond if you feel comfortable having that response. So I give a couple of suggestions there, knowing that everybody has to personalize these things. So I have folks who are saying that they have to run. I also have to run to yet another meeting because I apparently live in this chair these days. But I again want to thank everybody for coming and for the participation of the panelists and for you all for making this possible, because without people in the room, then it's, just sort of yelling endlessly into the void. So thank you very much and have a wonderful sunny rest of the day.
Thank you, Bonnie, and everyone.
Yeah.
Bye, everybody.